Okay, we're looking at the letter for the Royal Commission, Daniel Andrews' work. We have corrected it. All right, so we've done all the work, even though we don't get paid like he does for this kind of work. We run a gallery. So here we are. All right. Elizabeth II, by grace of God, Queen of Australian realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, blah, 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 I, Honourable, blah, 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 Governor of Victoria, advice of the Premier on Section 5 Inquiries Act 2014, then goes on to say all the appointed commissioners, which we would like to have replaced with people who actually have experience of forced and coerced psychiatry, or are at least have will enable impartial enough to enable these people to be able to speak, such as myself. So we don't want to be crushed by these people, and we don't want it to turn into a fundraiser for that. So to constitute a Royal Commission to inquire into and report on matters specified within the terms of reference. Okay, this is just the background. Forced and coerced psychiatry affects people of all ages, from all backgrounds, in all locations across Victoria. Each year, 1 in 5 people in Victoria will be subjected to forced or coerced mental health treatments. And some of these people will be forced only once and escape. For others that fight the system, that abuse is prolonged. And it occurs time and time again throughout their life, and they're never free. There are several population groups and communities within Victoria that are forced disproportionately to the rest of the community due to systematic discrimination and oppression, ongoing oppression that has been legislated in the past and is still legislated, and as well as pollution. This includes members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who have experienced intergenerational trauma and racism, and who are around 3 times more likely than non-Aboriginal persons to experience high or very high levels of forced psychiatry. Exploitation for invasive, cruel human research affects a person's wider health and well-being and general life prospects. It can impede on their ability to secure housing, maintain engagement with employment and education, feel included in society, participate in the community, and connect with their friends and family. For many, the oppression that continues to surround being subjected to forced psychiatry remains a barrier to being able to live their life and to the full. Forced psychiatry can also increase the likelihood of suicidal behaviour. Victoria's lost more than 600 lives to suicide in 2017, more than double the number of lives lost on Australian roads. How many of these suicides were directly related to forced and or coerced psychiatry must be found out by the Royal Commission. How many people died as a result of forced and coerced psychiatry due to other health conditions that are written up as cardiac arrest or diabetes and such, needs also to be found out. Now, despite the number of people who experience forced and coerced psychiatry in Victoria, only about half escape a lifetime of this abuse. So over the past 10 years, people seeking legal action, 90% of these people were not able to get legal aid. They were not able to receive justice. There's very little justice in the system as it is for people being subjected to this kind of exploitation under the Victorian Mental Health Act. And Victorian's mental health system is killing and maiming people, yet still there is no form of reparations or any insurance that this violence is going to stop. Every person who has been subjected to forced psychiatry deserves justice in the form of reparations and such assurances that these state violations will not occur again. People with the biggest stake in a better system are the people with lived experience of forced psychiatry, because they are the people that have put up a fight and been taken down in the most vile, cruel way. Continuing to understand and draw on their experience is critical to removal of forced psychiatry and the violations involved in coerced psychiatry in Victoria, and so that every Victorian can have the opportunity to experience health and remain well and live their life without fear of being disabled and exploited by their government's human research programs. Terms of reference set out below look into the input in the community and the consultation of the organisation by the Victorian Government. Now, I'm very aware that what was written below there needed to be corrected because it did not include the consultations with victims of psychiatrists. Pretty much didn't include anything except clinical views, which are not the views of the main bulk of the people who put filled in the terms of reference. So, terms of reference: you are appointed to inquire into Victoria's mental health system. It can most effectively prevent psychiatrists' violations and deliver reparations so that all those in the Victorian community will no longer experience forced and coerced psychiatry or detention on the basis of psychiatric labelling, and thereby experience their human rights and their health free from torture, free from the torture of forced psychiatry now and into the future. In particular, you are required to inquire into and report on the matters of how to most effectively prevent forced and coerced human research and support people to recover from forced psychiatry through use of Victoria's mental health system funds and close partnership with other services. So there's a lot of money there that could be used for reparations. Of course, we just want that apology and want the abolishment of the forced psychiatry. How to deliver the best reparations for forced mental health treatments and commitment and improve access to the navigation of Victoria's exploitation system. So the exploitation system's reparations for people of all ages. So strategies to attract, train, develop and retain highly skilled reparations workforce, including peer support workers, of course, but certainly people who have been on the forefront of attempting to get the exploitation racket abolished. Not just those who work in the system negotiating with the white coats and the perpetrators, and obtaining money from the government by going along with things that, they don't really want to go along with, but feel the need to get a buy-in to for their organisation and continue funding for their job. Okay, so strengthen pathways and interfaces between Victoria's victims of crime system and other services, because victims of government crime are just as much victims of crime as any other victims of crime. It would be excellent for these crimes to be prosecuted fully. the violations under forced psychiatry are the most horrendous violent crimes. And the unlawful Victorian Mental Health Act, which is an exploitation act, needs to be removed in order for the police to be able to do that properly. Though there is a point in the Code of Human Research 8.2 that allows the federal police to step in and stop forced psychiatry on the basis that it is forced human research, and that is a violation of the criminal code. So what we also want, we want to expose collection data and research strategies that were used to exploit victims of psychiatrists and monitor any further criminal psychiatric practices. How to best support the needs of family members and friends of people subjected to forced psychiatry. We'll have that. And how to improve reform outcomes, report medical violations, expose the systematic targeting of Victorian community, especially those at greater risk of oppressive mental health legislation, including but not limited to people from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, those subjected to forced psychiatry, suffering co-occurring illnesses, disabilities, multiple diagnosis or dual disabilities due to psychiatric drugs and procedures forced and coerced on them, or due to other circumstances like pollution, oppression and other kinds of violence besides forced psychiatry, those from rural and regional communities, and I'm not sure why that's being included, but obviously there is some kind of targeting there, so I'll leave that one in. Targeting of people who are isolated and maybe grieving at some point, and that they want to target rural communities. That's quite disturbing. And people who drink alcohol and use illicit drug or are detained due to criminal conviction, border control or disability. So these are the people that they are targeting. We don't have I'm not sure if they're targeting anybody else, but they were the ones that were outlined here. So I've sort of left them and written it so that it makes sense to victims of psychiatrists, because you can't have the derogatory language that Daniel Andrews was using in this report that didn't wash with victims of psychiatrists. That's highly offensive. So how best to support those in the community who are victims of psychiatrists. Any other matters necessary to satisfactorily resolve the matters set out in paragraphs 1 to 5. Okay, so report. You are required to report your findings and recommendations to the Governor as soon as possible in an event no later than an interim 30th of November 2019 that details identified by the Royal Commission proposed next steps to update the Victorian community and guide improved mental health outcomes and reform efforts. Well, I should have actually crossed that out. What are we going to talk about? Reform efforts. Okay, so if we're going to talk about improved mental health outcomes, we don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to cross that one out, and I'm going to say next steps to update the community on the abolishing forced psychiatry and reform efforts. So let's make sure that that is in there. And the recommendation, so the final report is October 2020. The recommendations, you may make such recommendations as you consider appropriate for the short, medium and long term. These recommendations should endeavour to achieve practical, prioritised, efficient and sustainable reparations that enhance the lives of people who have been subjected to forced psychiatry and Victoria's mental health system. In formulating your recommendations, you may have regard to any matters you consider relevant, including the evidence of people with lived experience of forced and coerced mental health treatments, the views and insights provided by the community to the Victorian Government to inform the development of the Royal Commission's terms of reference, particularly those of victims of psychiatrists ignored by the Minister of Mental Health, the advice of the Expert Advisory Committee that do not include perpetrating psychiatrists or mental health personnel or anyone with financial ties to pharmaceutical or medical research or medical product companies. The evidence of people who have been subjected to forced and coerced psychiatry who are engaged in abolishing forced psychiatry and demanding reparations for this exploitation. So really those people are key. Even if they're being tied to beds in those psych wards right now, they should be able to have a say. You should not be ignoring them and allowing the psychiatrists to say they're too ill to speak, because they're victims right now that should be allowed to be able to have their say. The need to recognise and respect the needs of different population groups and communities, including but not limited to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, young people and elders, children and young Victorians, including those currently or formerly out of home care, older Victorians, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, people with a disability, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, victims of crime, people experiencing family violence or homelessness, people living in rural communities, adults and young people in custody, people adversely affected by pollution. The need to stop the maiming and murder caused by forced psychiatry and social oppression of victims of psychiatrists, including problems of knowledge, attitude and behaviours towards people who have been subjected to these violations under the Victorian Mental Health Act 2014 and previous. The need to safeguard human rights, abolish forced treatment, ensure the participation of people with lived experience of forced psychiatry in decision making that affects reparations for them. Existing legislation and regulatory frameworks, including the Victorian Mental Health Act 2014 and any associated reforms you consider necessary or desirable or for abolition. Any cross-jurisdictional matters you would consider to streamline or the criminalisation of mental health treatment or services or otherwise assist in implementing. This is the conduct of inquiry area, without limiting the scope of your inquiry or the scope of the recommendations arising out of your inquiry. You may consider appropriate. You are directed to conduct your inquiry as to what you consider appropriate, subject to the requirements of procedural fairness, including adopting any informal or flexible procedures and practices. Hear from and have regard to evidence provided by the Expert Advisory Committee. Seek to raise awareness of the exploitative practices of mental health and reasons for an end to these associated violations. Have regard to the Productivity Commission's review of mental health and their lucrative trade in inhumane forced human research. I mean, all forced human research is inhumane, but the invasive, cruel nature of forced psychiatry it comes under the banner of torture, so and it is recognised worldwide as torture, so that we've got to emphasise that. Have regard to best practice approaches to reparations, both nationally and internationally. So that's when people are maybe no longer citizens of Australia or were never citizens of Australia but were subjected to violations here. Follow best practices approaches to engagement with people with lived experience of forced psychiatry, including the provision of opportunities for them to share their experiences while recognising that many of them will need support to disclose this trauma, massive trauma. especially if they had only just got free from it. And especially if they're also trying to taper the polypharmaceutical drug regime that have been forced onto. Have regard to relevant research past and inquiries, including the Royal Commission into Aged Care and Safety and the reports and reviews and evaluations that may inform your inquiry. Have regard to changes to laws, policies, practices, systems as a result of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, including changes that are intended to make it easier for people to navigate Victoria's justice and social services and service providers, to share information and interfaces between people who now have multiple needs due to being subjected to forced psychiatry or otherwise. Engage widely across Victoria, including conducting your inquiries in rural and regional communities. Regularly communicate with Victorian community in the progress and conduct of your inquiry. Have regard to the desirability of conducting your inquiry without unnecessary cost or delay. Conduct your inquiry in accordance with these letters, Patent Inquiries Act 2014 and other relevant inquiries. Now, the Expert Advisory Committee. You are directed to establish an Expert Advisory Committee to be not chaired by a psychiatrist or a person with financial ties to the mental health industry. I think that's clear, isn't it? Conflict of interest. The committee must include people with lived experience of forced psychiatry. Not just coerced psychiatry, it must include people with lived experience of forced psychiatry. So people who say they are victims of psychiatrists. The Expert Advisory Committee must be consulted about any matters which you consider appropriate to inform the inquiry's findings, recommendations, including, as appropriate, engagement strategies to inform the conduct of inquiry, opportunities to most effectively raise awareness of mental health systems violations as an issue needing reparations, and the likely impact of the Commission's findings and recommendations on reparations from the perspectives of victims of psychiatrists and the mental health system's legislative violations. You may direct or authorise the Expert Advisory Committee in the conduct of its engagement as you consider appropriate. You may consult with and engage any other experts and consultants as are necessary to provide relevant advice and assistance to your inquiry. Exercise of powers. The powers of the Royal Commission may, at the discretion of the chairperson, be exercised by one or more of the commissions at a time. Expenses and obligations. You are authorised to incur financial obligation to be met with the consolidated fund of $13,600,000 in conduct with this inquiry. Okay. Definitions, blah, blah, blah. Look, I was looking at all these definitions and started. Friend or family means a person, including a person under 18, who provides support to another person with whom he or she is in a mutually agreed relationship. You could say friend or family or support person. There's this carer. Get rid of it. Expert Advisory Committee means the Expert Advisory Committee under the Expert Advisory Committee letters pattern, blah, blah, blah. I don't think I changed much of this because, forensic mental health services, where people who fight back against forced psychiatry are placed denied ability to plead self-defense and sometimes never able to be free. Mental health workforce means those who are violently subject to mental health assessment, forced drugs procedures, tests and research, the victims of psychiatrists. It includes, but it's not limited, causing victims of psychiatrists. It is not included or limited general practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, counsellors, mental health workers, peer support. See, sometimes they are violators as well because they just go along with things. That's what we call turncoats. social workers and occupational therapists. Mental illness is a vicious slur. Person-centred means treating a person receiving healthcare with dignity, respecting their preferences, needs and values, and all decisions about their health treatment. Okay, so people with lived experience means people subjected to forced and coerced psychiatry or other violations of the mental health system in Victoria. So get that right, what that means. When you use the short term, that's what it means. Not what the violators say it means, what we say it means, because that's our term. Victorian's mental health system means vile, cruel exploitation racket. Okay, so this is the letter. Thank you for listening. I hope that will enable Daniel Andrews to rewrite this document, as at the moment it is full of crap, vile, cruel, disgusting crap that is insulting to victims of psychiatrists.